The difference between a good and a bad augment, and even a good and a great augment in TFT, can be the difference in going top 4 or bot 4, and it can even be the difference in going 1st or 8th. A question I get asked a lot is, what's the single best way to climb? And I think the answer is augment selection. Since the removal of augment stats, the answer isn't as simple as just plug whatever you're offered into the Explorer and then pick the augment that gives you the best placement. Instead, you actually have to look at the spot that you're in and the comp that you're playing to make an educated choice, and that's what I'm going to teach you about in this video. Now, before we get into the specifics of every type of augment and what to do in a lot of specific situations, let's just go over the formula. Now, the core principle behind augment selection is really simple. You actually just look at your board and see what you need. That sounds stupid, but when I coach players, I never see them actually look at their board during augment selection. Instead, they just look at the augments and pick the ones they think are going to be good for their comp and not for their spot. For an econ augment, an example could be that you're playing towards vertical rebels on 3-2 and you're offered Paint the Town Blue or Slam It. Now, Paint the Town Blue is obviously going to make the strongest board if we manage to hit all our upgrades, but if you're level 5 with only 30 or 40 gold and you're really poor, then I think it's generally better to take Slam It, because having an upgraded board is stronger than having a combat augment on an unupgraded board. For an item augment, let's say you're playing Camille reroll and your choices are between item grab bag and inspiring epitaph. Now, even though epitaph is going to be stronger on a final board, if your Camille only has 1 or 2 items, you always want to take grab bag, because the difference in having 3 good items on Camille versus Camille with 1 or 2 items with an epitaph is huge. The 3 item Camille is going to win against the 1 or 2 item Camille every single time. And if you're familiar with the game, like you know all the units and the items and the comps, then improving that concept is a great way to improve and climb really quickly. But if you're newer to the game and you don't have all that time to really think about everything, you're focused on your board and when to roll and stuff, then here's the real formula for the comps that are actually in the game. If you're playing a 1 or 2 cost comp with 2 or 3 carries, then you want item combat combat. If you're playing 3 cost reroll, then you want econ item combat. And if you're playing 4 costs and 5 costs, then you want econ combat combat. If all you wanted was a brief overview, there you have it. It's probably like a minute, but now we're gonna get into the nitty gritty. But not before I tell you to subscribe. Please subscribe. My main platform is... Let's start with econ augments. Now, generally, we only take 1 econ augment at the most, unless you're playing for a comp that goes straight to 9, or you're playing a comp so broken like 5 Fairy Callista from last set that all you need to do is hit your units and you insta the top 4. 1 and 2 cost reroll comps don't really need econ augments because they're so cheap. There are going to be exceptions, like the Family Vi reroll comp where you're looking at 3-star 4 or 5 different units, so augments like Starry Night are going to be really strong for that. But in general, if you're only looking at 3-star 1 or 2 units, then you don't need an econ augment. If you're playing 3 cost reroll, then you generally do need an econ augment unless your opener is so high roll, you're high HP and a high gold the entire game, and you can sack all of your stage 4, then you can just go like item combat combat. And for 4 and 5 costs, you almost always need an econ augment unless you're high rolling again, then I guess you could just get away with 3 combat or 2 combat and an item. As for what econ augments work in what comps, if it gives you XP, you have to play level 8 and 9, maybe level 7 if you natural a ton of the units, and then if you're going to play reroll, you take Prismatic Ticket or Starry Night, and Raining Gold flexes into both. And one last thing about econ augments is that they're stronger earlier than later, because in the early game you want as much money as possible so you're able to hit your board, and then in the late game you just want to make your board as strong as possible, either with more items or combat. For combat augments, they're the complete opposite of econ augments, as in they get stronger the later on in the game you go. This is for 2 reasons. The first being that the later on in the game you get, the higher level you'll be, so you'll actually have more units benefiting from the combat augment itself. And the second reason is that the later on in the game it gets, the more HP you're gonna have, the more damage you're gonna do, so combat amplifies that by even more than it would if you only had like 1-star units and low cost units on your board. A general rule for combat augments is that you need at least 1 combat augment in every game. Chances are in most games, even if you hit your final completed board like before everybody else, there is going to be somebody in the lobby that manages to hit that same board but with 1 or 2 combat augments, and they're just going to outscale you. So when do you want to take a combat augment? Well, if on stage 4 you have no combat, take combat. On stage 3, I really can't tell you if you want to take combat or not. You really have to look at your board. If you're poor, then you're going to take an econ augment. If having 3 items on your tank or carry or both is going to win you those rounds and save you a lot of HP, you're going to take items. And if you're going to take items, if you also need to itemize a lot more units starting stage 4 and 5. And then if you're strong enough, like you're playing a reroll comp and you already have 3 items on your carry, then just take combat so you can be strong the entire game. And on stage 2, I'd advise to stay away from combat augments unless you have a really strong board and you can kind of use that combat augment to win rounds acting as a pseudo econ augment. The first augment is probably the most important selection of the game because it kind of dictates what you're going to play. If you take a +1 or a hero augment, it locks you into a comp. If you take an econ augment like Slammin', it locks you into level 8. If you take a ticket, it locks locks you into reroll. Taking a combat augment if you know what you're doing and you have a strong board can be really strong. If it allows you to win streak the majority of the early and mid game, it's going to be great for you, and having 3 combat augments or 2 combat and 1 item are going to allow you to outscale everybody else. But if you don't know how to play it early and mid game, it can definitely make it so that you're just poor the entire game and you're never able to hit your units. For item augments, they're different from econ and combat because you don't really need an item augment every game. My general rule is that if you're going to play a comp that can itemize 3 or more units you can reasonably hit, you should probably take an item augment. I would say if you're playing a reroll comp, you almost always want an item augment on stage 2 or stage 3. This is for 2 reasons. The first of which is that in most reroll comps, you're going to be itemizing more than 2 units. Family Violet can carry Violet, Draven, and even Annie and Darius, and then you just put utility and tank items on Vander. Camille reroll can carry Camille with tank items on Garen, and then other carry items on your Smeech 3 if you hit it, or Echo 2. The only time I wouldn't take an item augment is if I'm close to my main carry and not close to anything else. So for example, on Family Violet reroll, if I have 8 Violets and 3 to 4 copies of everything else, and my Violet items are already pretty decent, I have 2.5 items, and I can complete the 3rd one on Carousel, then yeah, you probably don't want to take an item augment. You just itemize your main carry and then push levels for the traits. For 4 and 5 costs, I would say the item augments are pretty good, but you don't have to take them every game. If you're playing a comp like Twitch Mundo that really only itemizes 2 units, Twitch and Mundo, an item augment may not be necessary. But if you're playing a comp like Black Rose Heimer Malzahar, which itemizes Heimer, Malzahar, LeBlanc, Garen, and sometimes even Elise, a Mordekaiser, or a Jace, then an item augment can definitely be really strong, especially if you have like Heimer 2 and 1 Malz 1 with 3 items. I mean, if you've been playing the patch, you already know it's going to win your game. And for the last 2 types of augments, there's not much to talk about, so I'll go pretty fast. The first are going to be +1 and trait-specific augments. The general rule is that these types of augments are strongest on 3-2, followed by 4-2, and then finally the weakest at 2-1. On average, 2-1 is going to be the worst because a lot of people will just see the +1 or the trait-specific augment, think it's going to be an easy game, click it, even if they don't have the spot to actually play that comp. On the opposite end of the average, on the higher range or whatever it's called, if you have like Irelia 2, Vex 2, Ezreal, and a set on your bench, and you get offered Rebel +1, you're almost always going to click it because it averages probably like a 2, 2.5 from that spot, as opposed to if you click it from a bad spot, which would probably average like a 5 or a 5.5. 3-2 is the best because you're only offered these +1s if you're actually playing that trait itself, so you would obviously click it and it would fit really well into the board that you have. And the 5 or the middle breakpoints for a lot of verticals are a lot stronger in the mid game, so they can carry you there. You can save a lot of HP, make your items. And stage 4 is better than stage 2 on average, but I would say on most like normal situations it's probably worse because you didn't save a lot of that HP on stage 2 and 3 if you had that +1. This is kind of like you're already playing that comp, you're hoping for a +1, and you get bailed out by it. Finally, for real, for hero augments, you kind of just have to know if they're good or bad. In previous sets, we've had patches where hero augments are the most dominant thing in the world, and everybody knows because the stats are so big. But since they removed the stats, you kind of just have to see and watch streams or watch my videos on them to know if they're good or not. Or like, obviously, if you have like 5 Trundles with Trundle items and you get trolling, you're probably going to play it even if it's not that great, which I tried and I full streaked and I went 4th. So maybe you don't do it, but I don't know. Like, hero augments are hero augments. They're good if they're good, they're bad if they're bad. Oh, or TFT Academy, not sponsored.